Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corin. So, the more that I learn and listen to your episodes about the 12-day war with Iran last year and about what's happening at the moment was the force build-up and the potential signaling, it gets me really interested in just the world of signaling and relationships between countries that often goes beyond what seems to be going on the surface. One of the things I found really interesting about the 12-day war, and I think also the second of the Iranian ballistic missile attacks in 2024, the previous year, was that we saw these kind of informal alliances of countries that stepped up to help Israel in its hour of need, including Jordan, the RAF mobilizing from Cyprus, and I think I'm leaving out a couple of other countries, or maybe the involvement of a couple of other countries was, let's say, less clear. But even things like allowing the IAF to overfly their territory on sorties to and from Iran, if not actively intercepting missiles, was very significant strategically. So my question is, Herman and Corin, the build up to that conflict was kind of like this one. It was everything was on edge for a while, and we thought this might happen, and eventually it kicked off. But the involvement of these other armed forces, like the RAF specifically, never really seemed to receive much attention here, which I think is a real pity, because I was very touched by the idea that a foreign country would put their resources in the sky to help defend Israel. And besides a sense of gratitude, I guess I just wondered, was this like a planned thing, or was this really spontaneous? Because we talked a lot about the close cooperation between Israel and the US, and towards the 5-day war, or the 12-day war, sorry, the US was deploying that battery, so being very active, as I guess you'd expect. And most of the news coverage was, as now, dominated by things like Netanyahu visiting the US Army to discuss preparations. So the close working relationship, if you will, between those two countries wasn't very secretive or discreet, but it never really was discussed about how these other countries formed an alliance. I mean, I guess you could be cynical and say that the only reason that Jordan was helping was because if they didn't shoot down things that could fall in Jordan, but I don't think that was the only reason. I think there was something more purposeful to their participation. So it was fascinating to me to see. We've talked about the changing dynamics in the Middle East so much, and about, will Saudi Arabia join the Saudi Accords? What are the red lines? And my question, Herman and Corin, because I know I have to ask a question at some point. What do you think about how this came together? Would it have been something that was quietly negotiated between these militaries and kind of planned as a contingency that if this happens, you will get involved? Or is there any possibility that even though so much of this is, as we've discussed, actually much more planned and methodical than meets the eye, is there still room for spontaneity in military decision making, that the RAF might have a consultation with the British Prime Minister? This is happening in Israel. Do we mobilize squadrons from Cyprus and help Israel? Is that a decision that might come up even if it wasn't actively thought about or prepared for? Herman and Corin, let's talk about the international alliance that formed around the 12-day war and how that played out in reality.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. We are coming to you from a very rainy Jerusalem today, and honestly, it is the perfect weather to sit down and dig into some complex geopolitics. The stone walls of the old city look almost silver in this light, but the mood is definitely heavy. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother.
Herman Poppleberry here. And you are right, Corn, the rain definitely sets the mood for a deep dive. I have been staring at maps, flight path data, and satellite imagery all morning, so I am primed for this one. There is something about the sound of rain on the window that makes you want to look at the plumbing of the world, the stuff that usually stays hidden beneath the surface of the daily news cycle.
Well, that is good because today's prompt from Daniel is about something we have lived through recently, and that has really reshaped how we think about the Middle East. He wants to talk about the international alliance that formed during the 12-day war with Iran, and those massive ballistic missile attacks we saw back in 2024. Specifically, he is asking about the mechanics of it. Was this a quietly negotiated contingency plan, or was there actually room for spontaneity when the missiles started flying?
This is such a fantastic question because it touches on the difference between what we see in the headlines and the actual reality of international military cooperation. When you see a Royal Air Force Typhoon taking off from Akrotiri in Cyprus to intercept a Shahed drone over the Jordanian desert, that is not just a pilot deciding to be a hero on the fly. But at the same time, the fog of war is real. You could have all the plans in the world, and then the reality of 1,000 drones and missiles in the air changes everything. You are moving from a spreadsheet to a survival situation in a matter of seconds.
Right, and I think for a lot of people, the sight of Jordan, an Arab nation, actively participating in the defense of Israeli airspace was the big shocker. It felt like a massive shift in the regional tectonic plates. But before we get into the spontaneity versus planning debate, let us set the stage for Daniel. When we talk about the 12-day war, which for our listeners occurred just last year in late 2025, and the preceding attacks in April of 2024, what were the actual moving parts of this alliance?
It was really an ad hoc coalition that functioned like a well-oiled machine, which is a paradox in itself. You had the United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, acting as the primary conductor of the orchestra. They were the ones holding the baton. Then you had Israel's own multi-layered defense system, Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the Arrow 3. But the weird part, or the part that felt new to the public, was the involvement of the United Kingdom, France, and most notably, Jordan and several other regional partners who were less public about their roles. We are talking about a sensor net that stretched from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean.
And the Royal Air Force, the RAF, was operating out of Akrotiri in Cyprus, right? I remember seeing the footage of the typhoons taking off into the night. It looked like something out of a movie.
Exactly, and that is a great place to start looking at the planning aspect. The United Kingdom has had a presence in Cyprus for decades, but the specific mission of intercepting Iranian assets bound for Israel required very specific legal and operational frameworks. You do not just fly into another country's sovereign airspace to shoot things down without a very, very long paper trail. The RAF was operating under Operation Shader, which was originally about fighting ISIS, but the mission parameters were expanded. That expansion did not happen overnight. It was the result of months of what-if scenarios discussed in Whitehall and at the Pentagon.
That is what I was thinking. If you are Jordan, then you have these Iranian drones and missiles screaming through your sky. You are in a tough spot. You do not want them hitting your own people, but you also do not want to be seen as Israel's shield in a way that causes domestic unrest. So Herman, when Daniel asks if this was quietly negotiated, what does the research say? Was there a in case of Iranian attack binder sitting on a desk in Amman and Tel Aviv?
There almost certainly was. But it was not just a bilateral thing between Israel and Jordan. It was part of what has been called the Middle East Air Defense Alliance, or MEDI. This is something that has been in the works since the Abraham Accords in 2020. The United States has been pushing for what they call integrated air and missile defense for years. In 2022, the U.S. Congress actually passed the Defend Act, which specifically mandated a strategy for this kind of cooperation. The idea is that if Iran launches a massive attack, no single country can track and stop everything. You need a sensor net, where a radar in one country talks to a missile battery in another. So, the quiet negotiation was actually quite loud if you knew where to look in the legislative records.
So, when the first drones were detected in April of 2024, and then again during the high-intensity 12-day war last year, the spontaneity was actually just the execution of a pre-existing script.
Mostly, yes. But here is where it gets interesting and where Daniel's question about spontaneity really hits home. Even if you have a plan that says Jordan will allow the RAF to use its airspace, the actual decision to pull the trigger is a political one that happens in real time. During the 2024 attacks, the Jordanian government had to make a split-second decision. Do we stay out of it and let these objects violate our sovereignty, or do we engage? They chose to engage, stating they were protecting their own citizens. That is the spontaneous political courage layered on top of the planned military infrastructure. They used the language of sovereignty to justify the act of cooperation.
It is like having the blueprints for a house but waiting for the storm to hit before you decide to actually lock the doors. I am curious about the technical side of that coordination though. You mentioned CENTCOM as the conductor. How does that actually work? If I am a Jordanian radar operator, am I talking directly to an Israeli officer? Because that still feels like a bridge too far for some of these governments.
That is the million-dollar question, and it is where the weirdness of the prompt really shines. Traditionally, that direct line was a huge no. For decades, there was no direct line. But what we saw in these recent conflicts suggests that the United States has built a sort of clearinghouse for data. Think of it like a giant chat room or a shared digital map where everyone sees the same thing, but they might not be talking directly to each other. The United States takes the data from a radar in, say, a Gulf country, cleans it up, strips away the sensitive source data, and passes it to an Israeli interceptor battery and a British Typhoon pilot simultaneously. It is called Link 16 on steroids.
So, the alliance is informal, in the sense that there is no mutual defense treaty like NATO, but formal, in the sense that the hardware is literally plugged into the same socket.
Exactly. It is a coalition of the willing powered by American middleware, and that is why it could come together so quickly. But let us look at the RAF for a second, because that is another layer Daniel mentioned. The British involvement was quite extensive. They were not just shooting down drones, they were providing Voyager refueling tankers and Shadow R1 intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. That requires a massive amount of coordination. You have to have the tankers in the right orbit, so the fighters do not run out of gas while waiting for the drones to arrive.
And that is not something you just do. You have to have the fuel, the pilots on standby, and the rules of engagement cleared by London. I imagine the legal team at the Ministry of Defense was working just as hard as the pilots.
Right? And rules of engagement, or ROE, are where the spontaneity really dies. A pilot cannot just decide to fire a missile because they feel like it. They have to have specific authorization that says, if a drone enters this box, you are cleared to engage. During the 12-day war, those boxes were likely drawn and redrawn every few hours. The spontaneity was in the tactical adjustment. If a drone swarm changed course toward a Jordanian population center, the plan had to allow the pilot to follow it without waiting for a call back to London.
Okay, but what about the surprises? In any war, things go wrong. During the 12-day war in 2025, there must have been moments where the plan did not cover the reality. I remember reports of the sheer volume of fire being unprecedented.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most fascinating things that came out of the analysis of the 12-day war was how the coalition handled saturation. Iran's strategy was to overwhelm the sensors. They sent so many cheap drones that the plan for who shoots what could have easily broken down. There were reports of Israeli and American jets almost bumping into each other in the same kill box because the sheer volume of targets was so high. That is where the spontaneity comes in, the tactical level. Pilots and mid-level commanders making decisions on the fly because the script did not account for 500 targets in one sector. They had to deconflict the airspace in real time while moving at Mach 1.
That sounds incredibly stressful. You are flying at night, there are hundreds of explosive drones around you, and you are trying not to accidentally shoot down a partner's jet or a civilian aircraft that wandered into the wrong place. I mean, the civilian air traffic over the region did not just stop instantly.
It is the ultimate high-stakes video game, but with real lives. And it is worth noting that during the ballistic missile phase of the 2024 attacks, the speed of the targets meant there was zero room for debate. A ballistic missile from Iran reaches Israel in about 12 minutes. If you are going to intercept it over Jordan or Iraq, you have a window of maybe 2 or 3 minutes to make that call. That is where the quietly negotiated part is vital. You cannot call the Prime Minister for permission when the missile is already at Mach 5. The permission has to be pre-delegated.
So the spontaneity is actually delegated authority. The politicians say yes months in advance, so the soldiers can say yes in seconds. It is a pre-authorized reaction.
That is a perfect way to put it. It is pre-approved spontaneity. But I want to go back to Daniel's point about Jordan. Why do you think it feels so different this time? We have seen quiet cooperation before, but this was very loud. Jordan's Air Force was literally in the news for shooting these things down. Their pilots were being hailed as heroes in some circles and criticized in others.
Well, I think part of it is the changing nature of the threat. In the past, Israel's wars were mostly with its immediate neighbors. Now, the threat is regional and it is coming from over the horizon. If you are Jordan, you are literally the land bridge between Iran and Israel. You cannot afford to be a passive bystander because if a missile fails or is intercepted poorly, it lands on your cities. We saw that in 2024 shrapnel falling in Amman. But there is also the political signaling. By helping, Jordan is signaling to the United States that they are an indispensable strategic partner. They are saying, look what we can do that no one else can. It is about maintaining that special relationship with Washington.
And it is also a signal to Iran. It is saying, our airspace is not your highway. That is a very strong sovereign statement, but it is risky. We saw a lot of informal signals from other countries too. Some countries didn't shoot anything down, but they opened their eyes. They turned their radar systems toward Iran and shared that data with the Americans. That is a form of alliance that is almost impossible to see from the outside, but is absolutely critical for the sensor net I mentioned. Without those eyes in the Gulf, the RAF and the Israelis would have had much less warning time.
This makes me think about the future of these informal alliances. If they worked so well during the 12-day war, do you think we are moving toward a more formal Middle East NATO? Or is the informal nature actually its biggest strength? Because once you put a name on it, it becomes a target for every protest and every opposition party.
I think the informality is the secret sauce. In the Middle East, a formal treaty is a political nightmare. It creates targets for domestic opposition and makes you look like a vassal of a foreign power. But an informal agreement to share radar data or allow humanitarian use of airspace. That is much easier to defend politically. It is the don't ask, don't tell of military alliances. As long as it works, nobody needs to sign a piece of paper in a rose garden. The 12-day war proved that you can have NATO-level integration without the NATO-level bureaucracy.
It is interesting because it is almost like the technology has outpaced the diplomacy. We have the technical ability to link these countries together through satellite links and AI-driven battle management systems. But the diplomatic software is still running on an old version that does not allow for open cooperation.
That is exactly it. We are running Alliance 2.0 on a Diplomacy 1.0 operating system. And that brings up another point Daniel made about the buildup. We are seeing it again now. Force buildups, signaling, carriers moving into the region. It feels like everyone is rehearsing for the next 12-day war. The USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Theodore Roosevelt were both in the region recently, and that is not just for show. They are part of the calibration.
And that rehearsal is part of the planning Daniel asked about. Every time the United States moves a carrier strike group or deploys a THAAD battery, that is, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, for those who don't know, they are essentially calibrating the alliance. They are checking the connections. Hey, if we put this battery here, can your radar in the north see what it sees? It is a live-fire exercise in diplomacy.
Right? And we should talk about that THAAD battery because that was a huge deal in late 2024 and again during the escalation in 2025. The United States sent one to Israel operated by American troops. That is a massive formal step in an informal war. It says to Iran, if you hit this battery, you are hitting the United States Army. That is the ultimate signal. It removes the spontaneity of an Iranian attack because they know exactly what the American response will be.
It is a tripwire.
Exactly. A multi-billion-dollar high-tech tripwire. But let us look at the spontaneity from the Iranian side for a second. Their attacks were also signaled. In April 2024, they practically gave a 72-hour head start. That allowed the alliance to spontaneously get into position. It was almost like a choreographed dance. We are going to attack, you are going to defend, and hopefully no one gets so hurt that we have to start a world war. It was a controlled escalation.
But the 12-day war was different. That felt less like a dance and more like a brawl. There was no 72-hour warning there.
Much more. The spontaneity there was much more desperate. When Iran realized the April model of signaling didn't work to penetrate the defenses, they started changing their tactics in real time. They started using different flight paths, different timing, trying to find gaps in the sensor net. They used low-flying cruise missiles that hugged the terrain to avoid radar, and the alliance had to respond. That is where you saw the RAF and the United States Air Force doing things that were definitely not in the pre-negotiated script.
Like what? Give me some of that nerdy detail you love.
Like emergency cross-decking or sharing fuel in ways that were not standard. There were reports of tankers from one nation refueling fighters from another because the original tankers were forced to move due to incoming threats. Or pilots taking initiative to pursue targets into areas that were technically gray zones because they knew the sensor net would cover them. There were reports of Jordanian pilots and Israeli pilots essentially handing off targets at the border like a relay race. That requires a level of trust that you cannot build in a meeting room. It has to be built in the cockpit through shared experience.
That is a really powerful image. Two pilots from countries that do not even have a war and peace working together to stop a common threat. It makes you wonder how much of this alliance is actually just a few hundred highly professional people who decided that the mission was more important than the politics. It is the professionalism gap.
I think that is a huge part of it. We often talk about countries doing things, but countries are just groups of people. And at the military level, there is a shared language. A pilot in the RAF and a pilot in the Royal Jordanian Air Force have more in common with each other than they do with the average person on the street. They understand the physics of the threat. They understand the stakes. When a drone is heading toward a city, the politics of the border matter a lot less than the range of your missile.
So, to Daniel's question, was it planned or spontaneous? It sounds like the hardware was planned, but the software, the human trust and the quick decisions was spontaneous. It is a hybrid model.
I would agree with that. But I would add one more category, contingent spontaneity. This is the idea that you train so hard for every possible scenario that when something new happens, your spontaneous reaction is actually just a variation of 1,000 things you have already practiced. The RAF didn't spontaneously decide to help. They had practiced expeditionary air operations for years. Jordan didn't spontaneously decide to defend its sky. They had practiced sovereign air defense for decades. What was spontaneous was the alignment of those two things at the exact same moment under the pressure of a real attack.
It is like jazz. You have to know the scales and the structure perfectly before you can truly improvise. If you do not know the scales, the improvisation is just noise.
Herman Poppleberry loves a good music analogy. Yes, it is exactly like jazz, the Middle East Security Jazz Ensemble. It is a weird, dangerous, and incredibly complex performance. And the United States is the one providing the stage and the sound system.
I want to dig a bit deeper into the why of the RAF's involvement. Why Cyprus? Why the RAF? Why not just let the Americans and Israelis handle it? They certainly have the numbers.
Well, Cyprus is the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Mediterranean. From Akrotiri, you can reach the entire Levant in minutes. But the why of the British involvement is more about burden sharing and legitimacy. If it is just the United States and Israel, it looks like a Zionist imperialist project to some. But if the United Kingdom is there, and France is there, and Jordan is there, suddenly it is an international coalition for regional stability. It changes the narrative. It makes it harder for Iran to claim they are only fighting one enemy. They are fighting a consensus.
And the British have a lot of skin in the game in the region, historically and currently. They have significant interests in the Gulf. If the Middle East goes up in flames, the British economy takes a massive hit. Energy prices, shipping lanes, it all matters to London.
Absolutely. And let us not forget the intelligence side. The British GCHQ and the American NSA have facilities in Cyprus that are legendary. They were likely seeing the Iranian launch commands before the missiles even left the ground. That pre-warning is what allows for the spontaneity. If you know the attack is coming at 10:05 p.m., you can spontaneously have your jets in the air at 10:04. It looks like magic to the outsider, but it is just good data.
It is funny how spontaneity in the military often just means we had better intel than you realized. It is the illusion of the quick reflex.
Exactly. Magic is just science we don't understand yet, and spontaneity in war is often just intelligence the public hasn't heard about. During the 12-day war, the intelligence was likely being shared in real time through those middleware systems I mentioned.
I'm thinking about the informal part of this again. Daniel mentioned Jordan and the RAF, but what about the unnamed partners? We have heard rumors about Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates during both the 2024 and 2025 events. How do they fit into this planned versus spontaneous dynamic?
That is where it gets really quietly negotiated. If you are a country like Saudi Arabia, you are in a very delicate position. You are the custodian of the two holy mosques. You cannot be seen to be allied with Israel in a traditional sense. But you also see Iran as a primary existential threat. So, what do? You spontaneously fail to notice that Israeli or American jets are using a small corner of your airspace. Or you spontaneously share a radar feed because of a technical glitch that happens to benefit the coalition. We saw reports that Saudi Arabia provided vital tracking data during the April 2024 attack.
It is the oops school of diplomacy. Oops, did we just help you stop a ballistic missile? My bad.
Haha, yes. But in all seriousness, that kind of cooperation is deeply planned. It requires deconfliction agreements. You have to make sure your own air defenses don't shoot down the people who are trying to help you. That is incredibly technical. You need identification friend or foe, or IFF codes, that work across different systems. That is not something you do on the fly. That is months of engineers sitting in windowless rooms in Riyadh and Washington making sure the handshakes work. If you don't plan that, you end up shooting down your own allies.
So, when Daniel asks if it was quietly negotiated, the answer for the Gulf states is a resounding yes. It had to be. Otherwise, you would have blue-on-blue incidents where allies are shooting each other down in the middle of a crisis.
Right. And the fact that we didn't see any major blue-on-blue incidents during the 2024 attacks or the 12-day war is the biggest proof that the planning was world-class. To have that many different air forces, US, UK, French, Israeli, Jordanian, in a relatively small space at night under fire without hitting each other, that is a miracle of planning, not spontaneity. It shows that the Middle East air defense is a reality, even if it doesn't have a flag or a headquarters.
Let us talk about the takeaways for a bit. If I am a listener and I am hearing all this, what does it mean for the world? Does this mean we are safer because this alliance exists? Or does it mean the sides are just becoming more entrenched? Because it feels like we are building two massive high-tech camps.
It is a bit of both. On one hand, the shield worked. The fact that 99% of the targets were intercepted in April of 2024 was a stunning success. It showed that defense can actually win against a massive state-level attack. That is a deterrent. It tells Iran you can spend billions on missiles, but they won't hit anything. That should, in theory, lead to more stability.
But it also raises the stakes. If Iran knows their current missiles won't work, they might spontaneously decide to try something even more radical next time. Hypersonic missiles, more advanced electronic warfare, or even more decentralized swarms.
Exactly. It's an arms race of measures and countermeasures. But the real takeaway is the regional architecture. We are seeing the birth of a new Middle East that isn't based on peace treaties, but on shared security interests. It is a security-first model. And honestly, for a region that has been defined by conflict for a century, a security-first model where countries actually work together to stop missiles is a huge step forward. It is a pragmatic peace.
It's a cold peace, but with a very hot defense. I think that is the phrase that sticks with me.
I like that. a cold peace with a hot defense. And for the people living here in Jerusalem or in Amman or in Nicosia, that hot defense is the difference between life and death. When you hear the sirens go off, you are counting on that quietly negotiated plan to work. You are counting on a pilot you will never meet to make a spontaneous decision to pull the trigger.
I want to go back to the RAF for a second, because I think people underestimate the reach of a country like the United Kingdom in these situations. They aren't a superpower in the way the United States is, but they have these nodes like Cyprus that give them outsized influence. It is a very specific kind of power.
That is the Global Britain strategy in action. It is about being a force multiplier. The UK doesn't need 1,000 jets, they just need 50 jets in the right place at the right time with the right intelligence. And by being part of the coalition, they get a seat at the table when the day after plans are being discussed. They aren't just helping Israel, they are shaping the region. They are ensuring that the post-war order includes British interests.
And it's a great training ground for them too. Not that you want a war for training, but the operational experience gained during the 12-day war is something you can't get in a simulator. The data they collected must be incredible.
Oh, the data. Think about the electronic warfare data. Every time an Iranian drone is launched, it's emitting signals. The RAF and the Americans were scooping all of that up with their RC-135 rivet joint planes. They now know more about Iranian drone technology than almost anyone outside of Tehran. They know the frequencies, the guidance systems, the weaknesses. That spontaneous involvement leads to planned superiority in the future. It is a massive intelligence harvest.
It's a feedback loop. The more you defend, the more you learn, and the better you can plan for the next time.
Exactly. It is an iterative process.
So, Herman, if you had to give Daniel a final answer on the spontaneity versus planning scale, where do you land? If 0 is completely random and 10 is scripted by a supercomputer, where was the 12-day war alliance?
I'd give it an 8.5. The script was there, the hardware was there, and the legal frameworks were there. But that last 1.5, that was the human element. That was the Jordanian pilot deciding to engage despite the political risk, the British commander at Akrotiri managing a crisis when a tanker failed, and the Israeli technicians working 48 hours straight to reload interceptors. You can't plan for grit. You can only hope it's there when you need it. And in 2024 and 2025, it was there.
I think that's a really fair assessment. It's the grit that fills the gaps in the plan. And maybe that is what Daniel was sensing, that there is still something human and unpredictable at the center of all this high-tech machinery.
Well said, Korn. And I think it's also important to remember that these informal alliances are fragile. They depend on the political wind. If the government in London or Amman changes, the plan might stay the same, but the spontaneous willingness to execute it might vanish. We saw that tension in the UK Parliament during the 12-day war, lots of debate about the extent of the involvement.
That's the scary part. We are relying on these informal systems that could evaporate if the politics get too messy. It is a high-wire act without a safety net.
Which is why the quietly negotiated part is so important. You want to build systems that are so integrated that it's harder to unplug them than it is to keep them running. You want the default to be cooperation. You want the radar handshake to happen automatically before the politician can even pick up the phone.
Like a habit. A survival habit.
Exactly. We're trying to make regional defense a habit in the Middle East, and the 12-day war was a very, very intense habit-forming event. It forced everyone to see that they are in the same boat, whether they like it or not.
Well, I think we have covered a lot of ground here. From the Middle East air defense to the school of diplomacy and the grit that fills the gaps. It's a lot to process, especially with the rain coming down outside. It makes the world feel a bit smaller, doesn't it?
It does. But I think it's one of the most important stories of our time. It's about how the world actually works when the chips are down. It's less about the speeches at the United Nations and more about the radar handshakes over the desert. It is about the plumbing.
Definitely. And for our listeners, I hope this gives you a bit more insider perspective on those headlines from last year. It wasn't just luck that the missiles didn't hit. It was a massive hidden architecture of cooperation that has been years in the making.
A weird prompt. Indeed, Daniel, thanks for that. It really forced us to look at the plumbing of the war. It is easy to look at the explosions, but the real story is in the connections.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say, If you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird and complex world we live in, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review. Whether you are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your fix, a quick rating or a few words really helps other curious minds find the show. It makes a huge difference for an independent podcast like ours.
It really does. We love seeing the community grow and hearing your feedback. And remember, you can always find us at myweirdprompts.com. We have the full archive there, including some of our earlier episodes on the Abraham Accords and regional tech, which provide some good context for today's discussion. We even have some maps and diagrams of the SensorNet if you want to get really nerdy with me.
And if you have a prompt of your own, something that's been bugging you or a what-if scenario you want us to tackle, send it over to show@myweirdprompts.com. We love hearing from you. Daniel's prompt today was a great example of how a specific question can lead to a much bigger conversation.
We really do. This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Herman Poppleberry.
And I am Corn. Thanks for listening. Stay dry out there, and we will catch you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone. Keep those prompts coming.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.